In this video, we're going to take a look at how to build a temperature converter using Python. Let's go ahead and let's get started. The first thing I need from the user is a choice. I need to ask them, do they want to convert to Fahrenheit or do they want to convert to Celsius? Now, something you can definitely do is have them type it in. I don't want to account for a misspelling or hope that the user knows how to spell something correctly. I want to make my programs as easy as possible for my user. So I want them to enter an integer. So I'm going to say input. And I'm going to ask them, do you want to convert to, now option 1, that would be Fahrenheit. Option 2 would be Celsius. That's all I'm going to do. The next thing I need to know is what degrees are they giving us? It doesn't matter if they're converting to Fahrenheit or Celsius, I still need input of degrees. So I'm going to do user degrees. And I want to float because I want to be able to account for it in case they enter a decimal. So I'm going to say enter the degrees. All right. That's the hard part. Done. Very easy to build a temperature converter here. Now we've got to talk about selection. The user is going to make a selection. They're going to select either 1 or 2 as their choice. We need to code that out. Here's how you do selection statements or if statements. You type in if, you put a space. That's all you do. Then the next thing that comes is the condition. What's my condition? If choice equals 1. Now remember, we said when we're checking equality, we use a double equal sign because it is an integer, no quotes around it. Now, if choice equals 1, I let Python know that is my condition. I put a colon, I hit enter. Inside this indentation is my code that executes. If I do not put an indentation, the if statement it'll run, but nothing will happen. It is common practice to use 4 spaces as your indentation. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, when I type in colon, I hit enter, PyCharm will do that for me. So if choice equals 1, what do I want to do? Well, I want to create a final temperature variable, and I want that to equal, and all I'm going to do is run the Celsius to Fahrenheit formula, which is going to be user degrees, and I'm going to multiply that by 9 divided by 5, which is 1.8. Looking at the formula here, I want to make sure we're doing it correctly. And then 32. So that's one possibility. There's another possibility where they enter 2. Now, I could type in else here. I could type in else. That means if they enter anything besides 1. I don't want that to happen. I want them to enter 2. So I'm going to use else if. We abbreviate else if as EL for else, and then IF for the if. I type in my second condition, choice equals 2. Then what I'll do is I'll say final temp, and all I'm going to do is this time I'm going to use the Fahrenheit to Celsius formula. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my user, well, I'm going to be inside the parentheses. I'm going to take my user degrees. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to minus 32, and I'm going to multiply that by the result of 5 divided by 9. I want to use those order of operations correctly. I want to get rid of this extra space here. We don't need that. Now, if I put my print statement inside this indentation, that means it's only going to run when the else if statement runs. I don't want that. So I'm going to go down another line so I can have my code nice and organized. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the converted temperature is. Now, final temp. And you'll notice we're going to have an error here. It says string got float instead. So the problem with this is because this is not a string, I can't concatenate it. No problem. How do we handle that? We just put a comma. Now, when you put a comma, it will automatically handle final temp for you. Well, it won't handle final temp. What it will allow you to do is to concatenate both strings and numbers, which we haven't run into a situation where we do that yet. Here, we have run into that situation, so I'm showing you what to do. You can use a comma. Now, let's talk about, there's one other thing this comma does, which we'll see in a minute. Final temp, there's no error here. It's just saying it can be undefined. Python cannot predict whether or not these selection or these if statements are going to run. Because it doesn't know, it's saying final temp isn't undefined, but it can be undefined. Let's go ahead and run this. So when I run this, let's say I want to convert to Celsius. If I'm at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and I want to go to Celsius, that should come out to 100 degrees, and it does. Notice there is a space between the colon and the 100. Over here, there is no space between the colon and final temp like we had in a previous video. That's because when you use a comma, it will automatically put a space there for you. Now, we know that Celsius works. What we got to do now is we got to test Fahrenheit. If I'm at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, I know I must be at 0 degrees, what are we going to? We said we're going to Fahrenheit. So if I'm at 0 degrees Celsius, I should be at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and I am. If I'm looking at the rest of the world, like I'm going to the doctor, here in the States, I know that a regular body temperature should be 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, if I go to the doctor and he says, hey, you have a 37 degree body temperature, I'm not going to have any idea what that means. But because I have a temperature converter, I can type in 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. I want to convert that to Celsius, and the doctor tells me I have a 37 degree body temperature. I know that I'm feeling a-okay. So that's how you do it using if statements. What we're going to do now is we're going to use if statements, but we're actually going to write some functions to keep our code organized and also learn how to write custom functions. Let's take a look at that. Now let's write some custom functions here. Notice these 3 red lines, they'll go away in a minute. It's just saying, hey, final temp hasn't been created. When you create your custom functions, they need to go before you actually call them. We're going to call them inside these if statements. Remember, Python goes line by line. Before we can use the functions, we need to build them. Now, you can put it before or after these prompts. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and put them at the top. To define a function, we use def, which means to define. The next thing I need is a name. So I'm going to do to Fahrenheit. I'm going to put a set of parentheses, and I put a colon. Now I have a function. The function doesn't do anything. Notice the indentation? Just like selection statements, there needs to be a line of code here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do final temp equals, now we're going to talk about this in a minute because you may be getting slightly ahead of me and saying, hold on, that's not going to work. I know it's not going to work. We're going to talk about why. Then I'm going to put 2 spaces. That's common practice. And then I'm going to do to Celsius. I'm going to put my parentheses, I'm going to put a colon, and then I'm going to do final temp again. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that Celsius, because I know that formula works because we just tested it. So I put that in there. Now notice here, we need to call them. So when you have a function that you want to use, you have to call it. So you call it by its name, to Fahrenheit. That will call Fahrenheit. 1, 2, 3, 4, keep the indentations the same. I call it to Celsius. Now notice here, final temp is a red line. That's because it does not match this final temp or this one. These 2 final temps don't even match. They match in spelling, but that's about it. This is what we call a local variable. The local variable is locked inside this function. A different final temp is locked inside this function. There's a different one here that hasn't even been defined outside the function. Notice user degrees isn't underlined in red. That's because it's not locked in a specific function. It is available everywhere. So if I want final temp to work, what I need to do is I need to actually have these return a value. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to get rid of this final temp. I'm going to type in return. That will return user degrees minus 32. When it returns, I need to store it somewhere. I'm going to store it inside final temp. I put equals, and that will store the result of when we call the to Fahrenheit formula. Final temp equals. That's going to store the value of the Celsius and output final temp. Let's go ahead and run this, and let's see how it works. So I want to convert to Fahrenheit. If I have 100 degrees Celsius, that should come out to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Notice it does. Then we're going to test it again, and we want to, this time, convert to Celsius. If I have 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it should come out to 0 degrees Celsius, and it does. Perfect. Now, these functions that we have written do not accept a parameter. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it looks like when you create a function that takes a parameter and uses that. Let's take a look at that now. So now let's talk about functions that take a parameter. And let's talk about the word arguments too. A lot of people use them interchangeably. Arguments go inside the parentheses that are calling the function. Parameters is what's being accepted inside the parentheses that is defining or the name of the function. A lot of people use them the same, but that is the technical difference between them. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create temp. Now that does not stand for temporary, that stands for temperature. So rather than typing out temperature, we can call it temp. These two are not the same. They are not the same at all because they're two different parameters used by functions. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do temp times 1.8 plus 32, get rid of user degrees, and we're going to call this temp minus 32 times 5 divided by 9. And then notice we'll have an error here. What are we going to pass that becomes temp? That's going to be user degrees. So I'm going to type that in both here, user degrees. Now we have functions that use a parameter. What's the difference? In this case, there isn't one, but you may come across an assignment that says, hey, it accepts a parameter. If it accepts a parameter, you must write a function that accepts a parameter. If it just says you have a function that doesn't accept a parameter, then you would do what we just did. So when I call 2 Fahrenheit and I have user degrees, that goes to the 2 Fahrenheit function that we wrote, and then temperature or temp makes a copy of whatever value is stored in user degrees. This is going to return a value, it gets stored in final temp. The same thing for 2 Celsius. User degrees gets copied by this temp parameter inside the parentheses of the 2 Celsius. Because it's made a copy of the user degrees, it now has a value. So let's run this and let's see it in action. So let's say I want to convert to Fahrenheit. If I want to convert to Fahrenheit and I'm at, let's say, 37 degrees, that gives me a 98.6, a bunch of zeros, and then a 1. That's fine. There is a way to format it, and we'll get to that later on. Right now, we're just testing to make sure our functions work. And then what we want to do is if we want to convert to Celsius, and I type in 98.6 degrees, that comes out to 37. Hope you guys found this video helpful. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to help the channel grow. And we'll see you guys in the next Python video.